At 0115 hours on June 6, 1944, Major Friedrich von Die stood at the window of his command post near Carentan and listened to something that made his blood run cold. The sky above the Cotton Peninsula was filled with the drone of aircraft engines. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. The sound came from everywhere at once, a low mechanical thunder that seemed to swallow the night itself. Van Rate was a veteran. He had jumped into Cree in 1941. He had fought in North Africa with the Remke Brigade. He had seen combat on the Eastern Front. Nothing had prepared him for what was about to happen. Within the next 3 hours, more than 13,000 American paratroopers would fall from that black sky. They would land in fields, in flooded marshes, on rooftops, in trees, and in the middle of German positions. They would arrive, scattered, disorganized, many without their weapons, and they would terrify the VR matched in ways that no military planner had anticipated. What Vonda did not know, what no German officer could have predicted, was that the very chaos of this airborne assault would become its greatest weapon. The Americans were not landing in neat formations. They were landing everywhere, and that single word everywhere would appear again and again in German reports, diaries, and interrogation transcripts. Over the following weeks, the German officers who survived Normandy would write about these paratroopers with something approaching awe. Some would write with fear. A few would write with the kind of grudging respect that soldiers reserve for enemies who have earned it. This is the story of how American paratroopers created a new kind of psychological warfare, through careful planning, but through courage, adaptability, and an aggressive spirit that caught the German military machine completely off guard. In 1944, the German army was arguably the most professional fighting force in the world. Its officer corps had been shaped by a tradition, stretching back to Frederick the Great. German doctrine emphasized meticulous planning, precise coordination, and the systematic application of overwhelming force at decisive points. Poland had been conquered in 27 days. France fell in 6 weeks. Across Europe, the Wehrmacht advanced with a precision that seemed almost mechanical, yet hidden within this strength was a profound vulnerability. German military thinking depended on understanding the enemy. It required knowing where he was, what he intended to do, and how he would attempt to do it. German officers were trained to read the battlefield the way a chess master reads the board, anticipating moves, calculating responses, maintaining control through prediction and structure. The American paratroopers who landed in Normandy shattered this approach entirely, not because they were better trained, not because they had superior weapons, but because they fought effectively, in complete chaos. On the night of June 5, 1944, the German command structure was a study in organizational rigidity. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, was not even in France. Convinced, the weather made an Allied invasion impossible. He had traveled to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. General Wilhelm Falle, commander of the 91st Luftland Division, was en route to Rennes to observe a war game. Key commanders were absent. Decision-making authority was fragmented. The system assumed time, clarity, and control. The paratroopers gave them none of those things. Scattered across the Norman countryside, dropped miles from their intended landing zones. American airborne troops did not regroup according to plan because there was no plan left to follow. Instead, they improvised. Small groups formed around whoever happened to be present. Officers led privates, lead officers, units attacked objectives they hadn't been assigned, simply because they were nearby. Bridges were seized, roadblocks ambushed, German units engaged by forces that seemed to appear everywhere and nowhere at once. 2. German commanders trained to expect coherence. This was incomprehensible. Reports flooded headquarters describing enemy landings across vast areas. No one could tell how many paratroopers had dropped, where the main effort lay, or what the Americans were actually trying to do. The battlefield no longer resembled it looked like noise. And in that noise, German doctrine failed. The American paratroopers had turned disorder into a weapon. Chaos became camouflage. Uncertainty became paralysis. By the time German commanders began to understand what was happening, the moment to respond decisively had already passed. This was not an accident of history. It was a collision between two military cultures, one that required control and one that thrived without it. His division had been specifically trained to counter airborne assaults on the very night that training should have mattered most. Its commander was nowhere near his troops. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, General Wilhelm Falle, commander of the 91st Luftland Division, was driving through the Norman countryside in his staff car. He had spent the night away from his headquarters, returning from a wargame exercise. At approximately 0430 hours, Falle heard aircraft engines overhead. He understood immediately what was happening. This was the invasion. He ordered his driver to turn around and race back to his headquarters at the Château de Bernaville near Picaville. He never made it. A small group of American paratroopers from the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division had landed near the chateau. Dispersed and operating on their own initiative, they had established a road ambush leading toward the headquarters. When Falle's staff car approached, the Americans opened fire. First Lieutenant Malcolm Brannan, a 24-year-old officer from Headquarters Company, 3rd Battalion, shot and killed General Falle as he attempted to escape the vehicle. Falle became the first German general killed during the Normandy invasion. He died within hours of the first parachute drops, before he could issue a single order, before he could organize any response, before the German system could even begin to function. A division positioned specifically to defeat airborne landings was suddenly leaderless at the exact moment airborne troops were falling across its sector. The effects rippled outward. The 91st Division faltered almost immediately. Conflicting reports poured in. Units waited for orders that never came. Others acted independently, often in the wrong direction. German command and control, so dependent on clarity and hierarchy, began to fracture. And Falle's death was not an isolated incident. Across the Cotentin Peninsula, German officers were being killed, captured, or cut off from their units by small, aggressive groups of American communications were severed. Roads were blocked. Headquarters were attacked. The chain of command was disintegrating before the first Allied soldiers set foot on the beaches. This was not how airborne operations were supposed to work. The American airborne landings had been designed with specific, limited objectives. The 82nd Airborne Division was tasked with capturing Sainte-Mère-Église and securing crossings over the Murderate River. The 101st Airborne Division was assigned to seize the causeways leading inland from Utah Beach and block German reinforcements from reaching the landing areas. But the reality on the ground was far messier and far more dangerous for the Germans. Instead of a single, identifiable thrust, the Germans faced dozens of small, unpredictable actions. The Americans were everywhere and nowhere. No clear front, no clear main effort, only confusion, violence, and unanswered questions. For a military system built on order, this chaos was devastating. These were clear, logical objectives, but their execution went badly wrong almost immediately. Cloud cover over the Cotentin Peninsula forced transport pilots to climb or dive to avoid mid-air collisions. German anti-aircraft fire scattered formations even further. Many pilots, some flying their first combat mission, released their paratroopers early, late, or simply wherever they happened to be when panic set in. The result was catastrophic dispersion. Paratroopers who were supposed to land together found themselves utterly alone. Units meant to assemble at precise rally points were scattered across miles of hedgerows, swamps, and flooded fields. Carefully drawn plans dissolved in the darkness before the soldiers even hit the ground. The statistics tell the story. Of the 6,928 men of the 101st Airborne Division who jumped that night, only about 1 in 6 landed in their designated drop zones. The 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne suffered the worst scattering, with only roughly 25% of its men landing within a mile of their intended targets. After 24 hours of fighting, the 101st Airborne Division could account for barely 2,500 of its roughly 6,000 men under divisional control. The rest were scattered, wounded, captured or dead, by any conventional standard. The airborne operation was a disaster, and yet something remarkable happened. Private First Class Bob Nobles of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment landed alone in a farmer's field, with no idea where he was. Gunfire echoed in every direction. Most of his equipment had been lost during the jump. He was deep in enemy-occupied territory, surrounded, disoriented, and unsure if he would survive the night. His first encounter with another American came when a figure emerged from the darkness, shouting, "Don't shoot, don't shoot. I'm from Kokomo, Indiana. I forgot the password." Nobles laughed. In the middle of German-occupied France, lost, outnumbered, and hunted, he laughed. That moment captures the American paratrooper in microcosm. Not a disciplined automaton, executing a flawless plan, but a human being improvising under extreme stress, adapting, refusing to freeze in the face of fear or confusion. For the German defenders, this was incomprehensible. German doctrine assumed that an airborne assault would be deliberate and focused, aimed at specific objectives, unfolding according to a recognizable pattern. What they encountered instead was a scattered nightmare. Small groups attacking from unexpected directions. Lone soldiers cutting phone lines, ambushing convoys, seizing bridges, or simply creating noise and confusion. Far out of proportion to their numbers, the Germans could not tell what was real and what was accidental. And that uncertainty was deadly. German defenders were trained to respond to airborne assaults in a precise, methodical way. They were supposed to identify the drop zones, determine the enemy's intentions, and then concentrate overwhelming force to crush the paratroopers before they could consolidate. But how do you concentrate forces against an enemy who is everywhere and nowhere? How do you identify drop zones when paratroopers are landing in every field, every marsh, every village, scattered for miles in every direction? The German response fragmented. Almost immediately, local commanders were forced to deal with threats appearing in their immediate vicinity. They could not wait for orders from higher headquarters, because higher headquarters had no coherent picture of what was happening. Telephone lines had been cut. Runners were ambushed or never returned. Radio nets filled with confused, contradictory reports. Enemy sightings everywhere. Strength estimates wildly inconsistent. Objectives unclear. General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, commander of the 709th Infantry Division, had been attending a war game in Rennes when the invasion began. He raced back to his sector, only to find his division already in disarray. In his post-war account, written for the U.S. Army Historical Division, von Schlieben described the situation spiraling out of control. By June 7th, his forces were no longer even able to recapture Sainte-Mère-Église, much less hold ground against Allied naval gunfire and advancing armor. He personally had to rally retreating troops to prevent what he described as the beginning of a panic, triggered by reports of enemy tanks. The German General Staff had a word for battlefield uncertainty: Nebel des Krieges, the fog of war. But this was fog unlike anything they had experienced before. This was not simply confusion about enemy movements. It was uncertainty about the very nature of the threat. Were these paratroopers the main assault, or merely a diversion? Were there a few thousand of them, more tens of thousands? Were they attempting to seize Cherbourg, Carentan, or objectives that had not yet revealed themselves? German doctrine depended on clarity. It required understanding the enemy's intent before committing forces. But clarity never came, and in the absence of reliable information, German commanders hesitated. In war, hesitation is often fatal. By the time the fog began to lift, The paratroopers had already achieved what mattered most. They had not seized every objective. They had not followed the plan, but they had shattered the German ability to respond decisively. Before the first wave of Allied infantry ever reached the beaches, 7th Army Headquarters received its first reports of parachute landings at approximately 0130 hours on June 6, 1944. At that moment, the Army's commander, Generalleutnant Friedrich Dolman, was not at his post. Like many senior officers, he was in Rennes attending a war game, the very exercise that had drawn much of the German command structure away from Normandy. Did not return to his headquarters until after dawn. The timing of this war game proved disastrous for the German defenders. Approximately half of all divisional commanders in the Cotentin Peninsula were away from their units when American paratroopers began landing. Nearly a quarter of all regimental commanders were also absent. The exercise had been scheduled to test German responses to an Allied invasion. Instead, it ensured that the real invasion would strike a decapitated command structure. General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben later described the moment with bitter clarity. He wrote that he had departed for Rennes late in the afternoon of June 5th, accompanied by the commander of the 739th Grenadier Regiment. When the invasion began, both men were miles from their divisions, able to issue orders, unable to coordinate responses, able to do nothing except race back through the Norman night, hoping to arrive before it was too late. They did not. In Dolman's absence, the 7th Army's Chief of Staff, General Major Max Pemsel, struggled to make sense of the fragmentary reports flooding in. Paratroopers had been sighted near Sainte-Mère-Église. Others were reported south of Carentan. Still more were supposedly landing near Montebourg, near Valognes, and at dozens of other locations across the peninsula. The reports contradicted one another, overlapped, and multiplied by the hour. Pemsel reached a clear conclusion. This was not a diversion. This was the invasion. He telephoned General Gunther Blumentritt at OB West headquarters and insisted that Normandy was the main Allied effort. Blumentritt passed the assessment to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. Von Rundstedt dismissed it. Normandy, he declared, was merely a diversion. The real invasion would come at Calais. This disagreement at the highest levels of German command proved paralyzing. Critical reserves were not released. Counterattacks were delayed. Authority was deferred upward, then stalled in debate. Hours passed. The Germans could not afford to lose. Pemsel was right. Von Rundstedt was wrong. By the time the German High Command accepted the truth, the airborne landings had already achieved their most important objective. Not the seizure of terrain, but the destruction of German decision-making at the moment when decisions mattered most. But by the time the truth became undeniable, the Americans had already established their foothold. The confusion was intensified by the use of dummy parachutists. Operation Titanic. These were small mannequins, nicknamed Ruperts, weighted and fitted with parachutes, deliberately dropped far from the real landing zones. When they struck the ground, small explosive charges detonated to simulate rifle and machine gun fire. German units responded exactly as the Allies had hoped. Troops were diverted. Patrols were dispatched. Entire formations wasted precious hours chasing enemies who did not exist. By the time General Major Max Pemsel grasped that the main American effort was concentrated on the eastern side of the Cotentin Peninsula, the opportunity for a coordinated response had passed. The paratroopers had already seized or at least contested key terrain. The beach landings were underway. The German defensive plan was in shambles. This collapse of German command and control on D-Day was not simply a matter of bad luck. It was the product of a deliberate American strategy, though not entirely the strategy that had been planned. Allied planners had envisioned airborne troops landing in concentrated groups, seizing specific objectives, and holding them until relieved by forces advancing from the beaches. The widespread scattering of paratroopers was considered a failure at the time. Yet in practice, that chaos served American purposes brilliantly, even if unintentionally. The German military was organized to respond to clearly identified threats in specific locations. When threats appeared everywhere at once, the response mechanism broke down. The system could not cope with ambiguity. It demanded clarity. Clarity never came. One man's experience captures this transformation from disaster to advantage. First Lieutenant Richard Winters, of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, landed in a field near Sainte-Mère-Église at approximately 01:00 hours. Like most paratroopers that night, he was alone and disoriented. Winters was 26 years old, a farm boy from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. He had never been in combat. The aircraft carrying Easy Company's commander and much of the headquarters staff had been shot down. Every officer, senior to Winters in Easy Company, was either dead or missing. By doctrine, by plan, by expectation, Easy Company should no longer have existed as a coherent unit. But the German defenders had made a fatal assumption that American effectiveness depended on organization imposed from above. What they encountered instead was leadership that emerged from necessity, initiative born of isolation, and a willingness to act without orders. Winters did not wait, and neither did dozens of other young officers and non-commissioned officers scattered across Normandy. That night, American airborne forces did not fight as a division or even as regiments. They fought as small groups of men, moving aggressively, improvising targets, creating confusion far out of proportion to their numbers. The German command system could not defeat an enemy it could not define. Within hours, Winters would lead one of the most celebrated small unit actions of the entire war. By dawn on June 6th, Winters had gathered roughly a dozen paratroopers from several different units. Men who had landed scattered across Normandy and attached themselves to whoever seemed to know what to do next. Winters did. His battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Strayer, ordered him to eliminate a German artillery battery that was firing directly on Utah Beach. The battery was located at Brecourt Manor, approximately 300 meters from the American assembly area near Sainte-Mère-Église. Winters conducted a rapid reconnaissance. What he found should, by any conventional measure, have been overwhelming. For German 105 mm howitzers were dug in along a hedgerow, connected by a trench system, and protected by multiple machine gun positions. The battery was defended by roughly 60 German soldiers. Winters had 12 men. There was no time to wait for reinforcements. The guns were already firing. Winters made a decision and then acted. He divided his force into assault and support elements. A small support team was positioned to provide suppressive fire with machine guns. Winters then sent a three-man team to flank the first gun position, armed with grenades. As they attacked the first emplacement, Winters personally led the main effort down the trench line, moving from gun to gun, exploiting the German defensive layout against itself. The attack was textbook in its execution. The only problem was that no one had taught the textbook yet. The first gun was taken, then the second, then the third. Each position was neutralized in turn through coordinated movement, suppressive fire, and aggressive leadership at the point of contact. As the fight continued, reinforcements arrived. Paratroopers from Dog Company, led by 2nd Lieutenant Ronald Spears. Together, they assaulted and destroyed the fourth gun. By the end of the action, approximately 23 American paratroopers had taken part. The entire engagement lasted about 3 hours. 15 German soldiers were killed. Many more wounded or captured. Most importantly, the battery threatening Utah Beach was silenced. Among the captured materials was a map detailing the locations of German artillery positions throughout the Peninsula. Intelligence of immense value to the advancing Allied forces. What happened at Brecourt Manor was more than a tactical success. It was proof that initiative could replace orders, that junior leadership could substitute for hierarchy, and that small, aggressive units could defeat larger prepared forces through speed, adaptability, and audacity. The German army had trained to defeat airborne divisions. Instead, it was undone by lieutenants, sergeants, and privates, acting without waiting for permission. This was the real psychological shock of D-Day. Not that the Americans had landed, but that they kept fighting effectively when everything went wrong. That captured map would prove invaluable to American forces. The suppression of the Brecourt Manor battery allowed troops landing at Utah Beach to move inland with far fewer casualties than they otherwise might have suffered. Winters was recommended for the Medal of Honor. He received the Distinguished Service Cross instead, reportedly due to an informal policy limiting Medal of Honor awards to one per division during the Normandy invasion. But what made Brecourt Manor significant was not merely its tactical success. It was the way Winters adapted to impossible circumstances. He had no heavy weapons, no air support, no numerical advantage. He had a handful of men, most of whom he had never worked with before. He attacked anyway. He did not wait for conditions to improve. He did not wait for orders that might never come. He acted. That aggressive spirit appeared again and again across the Carentan Peninsula on June 6th. Small groups of American paratroopers, cut off from their units and often from their officers, did not go to ground and wait for rescue. They attacked. They moved. They created problems for the enemy wherever they happened to land. In the town of Sainte-Mère-Église, paratroopers from the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment seized control before dawn. It became the first town in France liberated by American forces. The assault was not coordinated. It was not planned. It happened because individual soldiers recognized an opportunity and acted before the Germans could react. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krause, commander of the 505th, led a small group into the town center at approximately 0400 hours. His men had landed scattered across the surrounding countryside. Many had lost their equipment bundles. Some carried only pistols, rifles with limited ammunition, or even knives. They took the town anyway. German defenders were killed or captured before they could organize meaningful resistance. The swastika flag was torn down from the town hall. In its place, an American flag, carried, folded inside. A paratrooper's jump jacket was raised over the square. This was not how invasions were supposed to work. An invasion, according to doctrine, required preparation, concentration of force, and overwhelming firepower. Sainte-Mère-Église fell to a handful of men, who moved faster than the enemy could understand what was happening. Similar scenes unfolded. Across Normandy that night, roadblocks were seized by squads. Bridges were held by sergeants. German units were pinned down by forces they vastly outnumbered, simply because they could not determine how large the American presence really was. Everywhere, small, aggressive actions created the illusion of a massive, coordinated assault. The German army had prepared to fight divisions. Instead, it was forced to fight chaos, and chaos wielded by determined men willing to act without orders proved to be one of the most effective weapons of DA. Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment led an assault on a series of German barracks buildings near the village of Sainte-Comdu. He had been ordered to clear the position with a small squad of roughly 15 men. When most of his soldiers hesitated under heavy fire, Summers went forward anyway. Only 2 men followed him. Private William Bittner provided covering fire with a machine gun. Private John Kamek joined Summers in the assault. Summers kicked in the door of the first building and killed the German soldiers inside with his submachine gun. Then he moved to the next building and the next. For nearly 5 hours, Summers fought his way through the position building by building, room by room. When it was over, more than 30 German soldiers were dead, and the position had been cleared by a handful of Americans who refused to stop moving forward. Summers, commanding officer, recommended him for the Medal of Honor. Like Winters, he received a lesser decoration instead. Stories like this could fill volumes. Every paratrooper who jumped into Normandy that night had a story. Most of those stories will never be told. The men who lived them are gone, and they carried their memories with them. What survives instead is the cumulative record, and that record tells a remarkably consistent story. These were men who refused to accept that their situation was hopeless. The German officer corps had been trained to expect rational behavior from its enemies. An outnumbered force should seek to preserve itself. A scattered force should consolidate before engaging. An isolated force should defend until relieved. The Americans did none of these things. Instead of consolidating, they attacked. Instead of waiting for orders, they acted. Instead of preserving themselves, they accepted risk again and again because speed and aggression created opportunities that caution never would. German commanders noticed Major Friedrich von der Heydte, commander of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, had his own encounter with American aggression beginning on June 6th. Von der Heydte commanded one of the most elite formations in the German army. His paratroopers were veterans of Crete, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. Among the best-trained soldiers in the Wehrmacht, von der Heydte had positioned his regiment to defend Carentan, the critical crossroads town, linking the American beachheads at Utah and Omaha. Whoever controlled Carentan controlled the connection between the two Allied lodgements that night. His regiment would earn a grim distinction. They would be among the few German units that managed to fight with coherence and determination during the airborne Carentan. Even they would struggle to understand what they were facing. The Americans were not advancing in massed formations. They were not waiting to be identified. They were not behaving like an army that had lost control. They were behaving like an enemy that could not be predicted. And for a military system built on prediction, that was the most dangerous kind of opponent of all. The 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment was the first German unit to spot the incoming American landings in Normandy, specifically the Pathfinders of the 101st Airborne Division, who landed between Sainte-Mère-Église and Carentan at around 600 hours. On June 6, 1944, Major Friedrich von der Heydte personally interrogated, captured American Pathfinders in. He was struck by their distinctive appearance. Many had shaved their heads into Mohawk style cuts and painted their faces for battle. Von der Heydte reportedly remarked to his staff, "Now they are sending us, they're Indians." The captured Americans told von der Heydte something that would prove prophetic. They claimed that German forces believed there were roughly 10 times as many Americans on the peninsula as there actually were. The scattered drops had created an illusion of overwhelming force, an effect amplified by confusion, noise, and the unpredictability of the landings. Von der Heydte had expected the Americans to spend several days consolidating their scattered units before attempting any major operations. Instead, the Americans struck immediately on June 10th. 4 days after the initial landings, the assault on Carentan began one of the most bitter and bloody battles of the entire Normandy campaign. American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne advanced along exposed causeways under withering German fire. They waded through flooded fields, waist-deep in water, and fought house to house through the streets of the town. Von der Heydte later wrote about his opponents with evident respect. He noted their willingness to take casualties, their refusal to break under fire, and their aggressive tactics even when outnumbered. His regiment earned a nickname from the Americans who fought them, the Lions of Carentan. At one point during the battle, the Americans negotiated a 2-hour truce at noon on June 11th to collect their dead and wounded. General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne, used the opportunity to send a message to von der Heydte, demanding his surrender. Von der Heydte had received orders from Field Marshal von Rundstedt to hold Carentan at all costs. He could not surrender, even if he had wanted to, but his regiment was running low on ammunition and had already suffered severe casualties. The Americans kept coming. The battle for Carentan was a stark demonstration of the new reality in Normandy. Initiative, aggression, and decentralized action could overcome even the most elite German formations when the defenders were confused, scattered, and forced to react rather than act. When Taylor's surrender demand arrived, Major Rolf Mayer of the 2nd Battalion replied in English with a question of his own. Would you surrender in the same situation? The fighting around Carentan had already exacted a terrible toll on von der Heydte's regiment. Major Emil Pracker, commanding the 1st Battalion, had led attacks against the 101st Airborne at Sainte-Mère-Église. By the evening of June 7th, Pracker's men were decimated, most wounded, exhausted, and unable to continue effective combat. They accepted an offer of surrender from Colonel Howard Johnson of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. Only 25 men escaped to rejoin the main German positions at Carentan. Elite German paratroopers veterans of Crete, North Africa, and the Eastern Front were being destroyed by American paratroopers, who had been in combat for less than 48 hours. On June 12, von der Heydte ordered his surviving troops to withdraw from Carentan under cover of darkness. Fighting continued during a German counterattack on June 13, before the town finally fell securely to the Americans on June 14. With the fall of Carentan, the Utah and Omaha beachheads were linked. The American position in Normandy was secure, and von der Heydte's elite paratroopers had been pushed back by men who had been in combat for less than a week. The German 7th Army kept meticulous records of the Normandy campaign, including after-action reports, intelligence summaries, and the personal observations of officers at all levels. These documents reveal a military organization struggling to understand an enemy that did not behave as expected. German intelligence officers compiled analyses of American tactics, studied captured documents, and interrogated prisoners in search of patterns that might allow them to predict U.S. behavior. They largely failed. A German report dated June 20, 1940, known as the von Rundstedt Report, No. 55,044 set. To summarize what had happened, it documented the chaos, the unexpected aggressiveness of American paratroopers, and the systemic breakdown of command and control. The report highlighted a central truth. The Americans did not fight according to doctrine. They improvised. They acted aggressively, even when isolated, and they refused to be paralyzed by the fog of war. For the German army, Normandy had become a case study in the dangers of rigid command structures facing an unpredictable, adaptive enemy. The von Rundstedt report noted that only in the American bridgehead, north of Cap, were enemy airborne troops, compressed in the direction of the coastal defenses received only after days of hard fighting. The phrasing revealed German frustration. They had expected to crush the paratroopers quickly. Instead, they had fought for days merely to contain them. The American paratroopers did not follow predictable patterns, not because of incompetence, but because they were not trying to follow patterns. They were trying to accomplish objectives. When one method failed, they tried another. When conditions changed, they adapted. Their actions were guided by goals rather than procedures. This goal-oriented approach was second nature to American soldiers. It reflected the culture in which they had been raised. American boys of the 1930s and 1940s grew up tinkering with machines, improvising solutions, and figuring things out for themselves. They brought this mentality to warfare, and it drove their German opponents to distraction. Certain themes appear repeatedly in German documents discussing American paratroopers. The word aggressive appears constantly. German officers observed that Americans attacked when conventional wisdom suggested they should defend. They took risks that seemed foolhardy. They pressed forward, despite casualties that would have caused other units to fall back. The word unpredictable appears almost as often. German intelligence officers complained that American paratrooper units did not behave according to rational military principles. They did not wait for supply lines. They did not pause to consolidate. They did not appear to care that they were outnumbered or surrounded. Perhaps most significant, German reports noted the quality of American junior leadership. In the Wehrmacht, decisions flowed strictly from the top down. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers were expected to execute orders precisely, not improvise. In contrast, American paratroopers frequently made decisions in the field, acted independently, and accepted responsibility for outcomes. Their initiative created opportunities that German doctrine could not anticipate or counter in Normandy. This cultural and tactical difference became lethal. Aggressive, adaptable, and goal-driven small units overran carefully prepared positions, seized terrain, and forced elite German formations to react rather than act. For the Germans, the Americans were not just soldiers, they were a force that could not be predicted, constrained, or easily defeated. In the Wehrmacht, orders flowed from the top down, and soldiers executed them. Initiative at lower ranks was rarely encouraged. American paratroopers operated differently. When officers were killed or separated from their units, sergeants assumed command. When sergeants were unavailable, corporals stepped up. Even privates made tactical decisions that in the German army would have required approval from officers far above their pay grade. This decentralized approach baffled and terrified German defenders. They could not decapitate American units by killing their officers because the units kept fighting under whoever was left alive to lead them. Feldwebelgeiger Erwin Schmeiger, serving in the 9th Parachute Regiment during the Normandy campaign, recalled his encounters with American troops in a post-war interview documented by historian Gilberto Schmeiger described his opponents as madmen. He specifically mentioned soldiers of the 2nd Infantry Division, whose uniforms bore the Indian head insignia, but his description could have applied to nearly any American unit in Normandy that summer. One night in particular left a lasting impression. German paratroopers held positions along the edge of a wood, each man in a foxhole roughly 50 meters apart. They could hear Americans moving through the darkness. There was no gunfire, no artillery, the faint sound of men creeping through the underbrush. Then came a scream. A German soldier in a nearby foxhole had been killed silently. His throat cut, the Americans had struck without warning and vanished again into the night. Schmeiger spent the rest of that night in his foxhole, trembling, unable to see his enemy, but aware that they were there, waiting, patient, invisible. This was psychological warfare in its most primitive and effective form. The Americans had learned to fight like hunters, moving under cover of darkness, striking silently, and using terrain that the Germans had believed would protect them as concealment for their own infiltration. Schmeiger survived the war. Many of his comrades did not. The lesson was clear. Decentralized initiative, aggressiveness, and adaptability allowed American paratroopers to exploit fear itself as a weapon. They did not rely on doctrine. They did not wait for orders. They fought like men who understood that survival and victory often required independent action, and that approach shattered the expectations of the most disciplined army in Europe. The scattered airborne drops on June 6 had been considered a failure by American planners. Casualties were severe. Most units landed far from their designated objectives. The elaborate plans developed over months of preparation were rendered worthless within minutes of the first jumps. But the Germans saw something different. They saw an enemy who could turn disaster into advantage. The scattered drops created confusion, not just for the Americans, but for the Germans as well. The defenders could not identify the main threat, because there was no single main threat. Hundreds of small threats appeared simultaneously across the countryside. German reserves that should have counterattacked the beaches were instead chasing phantom paratroopers through Norman hedge. Units that should have reinforced coastal defenses were tied down in desperate skirmishes behind their own lines. The entire German defensive scheme was disrupted not by a concentrated blow, but by 1,000 pinpricks that collectively bled the defenders dry. By the end of June 6, the American Airborne Divisions had suffered roughly 2,500 casualties, yet they had achieved something that no amount of meticulous planning could have guaranteed. They had paralyzed the German response at the most critical moment of the invasion. The days that followed brought even fiercer fighting. The Norman hedge's ancient earthen walls, topped with thick vegetation, transformed every field into a potential fortress. Paratroopers who had survived the initial drop now faced a different kind of war. They were no longer contending with scattered landings or disorganized defenders. They were confronting entrenched positions, deadly natural obstacles, and a German army fighting desperately to regain control. Still, the lessons of June 6 remained. Initiative, adaptability, and decentralized action had allowed American paratroopers to seize the momentum, even against prepared defenses and overwhelming terrain. The enemy's rigidity and the Americans' willingness to improvise would continue to shape the battle for Normandy. This was no longer the mobile warfare of airborne assault. This was grinding, brutal combat, measured in yards rather than miles. The heroism demanded tested American soldiers in ways that nothing in their training had prepared them for. Visibility was limited to feet. Enemies could be hidden just meters away, behind hedgerows, or in ruined farmhouses. Every advance required clearing fields, one at a time, often at terrible cost. The German defenders fought with skill and determination. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened by years of combat against the Soviets. They knew how to use terrain, how to set ambushes, and how to exact a heavy price for every inch of ground. But the American paratroopers adapted. They developed new tactics for hedgerow fighting. They learned to work with tanks, using explosives to blast gaps in earth walls. They coordinated artillery with infantry assaults. They moved at night, infiltrating German positions under the cover of darkness. German officers who faced them noted this adaptability with concern. The Americans they fought in late June were not the same soldiers who had landed on June 6th. They were harder, more experienced, and more dangerous. The lessons of Normandy were being written in real time, and both sides remembered them. When Hitler launched his final offensive in the West in December 1944, the German attack drove a massive bulge into American lines in the Ardennes. Panzer divisions raced toward the critical crossroads town of Bastogne. The Americans rushed the 101st Airborne Division to hold the town. Many of the same men who had jumped into Normandy 6 months earlier. They arrived in Bastogne on December 19th, just hours before German forces surrounded the town. For the next week, the paratroopers held Bastogne against everything the Germans could throw at them. They fought in freezing temperatures, with inadequate supplies of ammunition, food, and medical equipment. Their experience in Normandy learning to improvise, to act decisively under isolation, to adapt to chaotic and lethal conditions, had prepared them to do the impossible once again. The story of American airborne forces was not just one of daring landings. It was a story of adaptation, resilience, and initiative under fire. The Germans may have been the best-trained army in Europe, but in the chaos of war, flexibility and audacity proved to be decisive. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and completely cut off from relief. On December 22, 1944, German officers approached the American lines under a flag of truce. They carried a formal surrender demand for the American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne, gave them a single-word response: nuts. The German officers were baffled by this American slang. They asked for clarification. An American colonel explained. The general's answer was no. The Germans left, and the bombardment resumed. The paratroopers continued to fight. 4 days later, armored units from General George Patton's Third Army broke through the German encirclement and relieved Bastogne. The Bulge was contained. The German offensive failed, and the 101st Airborne added another chapter to its growing legend. The Germans who survived the Battle of the Bulge later described the American paratroopers at Bastogne with the same mixture of frustration and respect that their predecessors had shown after Normandy. These were not men who followed predictable military calculations. They were men who refused to quit. Regardless of the odds, the creation of American airborne forces had been controversial from the beginning. In 1940, the United States Army had no paratroopers. The concept of vertical envelopment, dropping soldiers behind enemy lines by parachute, had been pioneered by the Soviets in the 1930s. The Germans had used airborne forces to spectacular effect in their conquests of Norway, the Low Countries, and Crete. American military leaders watched these developments with interest, but with skepticism. Airborne operations were expensive. Training paratroopers required specialized equipment and extensive preparation. Combat jumps carried terrifying casualty rates. Many senior officers questioned whether the benefits justified the costs. General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, believed they did. He understood that airborne forces could achieve results no other unit could, striking unpredictably, seizing objectives before the enemy could respond, and turning chaos into a force multiplier. Normandy, Bastogne, and countless smaller engagements would prove him right. General George C. Marshall authorized the formation of a test platoon at Fort Benning, Georgia. In June 1940, the platoon consisted of 50 volunteers drawn from the 29th Infantry Regiment. On August 16, 1940, Lieutenant William Ryder became the first American officer to make an official military parachute jump. The first enlisted man to jump was Private William King, who only took the first spot because the soldier ahead of him in line refused to go. With that jump, the airborne era of the American military had begun. What followed was one of the most grueling training programs in military history. Paratrooper candidates were pushed to the absolute limits of physical and psychological endurance. They ran for miles every day. They practiced hand-to-hand combat. They learned to pack their own parachutes, knowing that a single mistake could cost them their lives. The training compressed months of conventional infantry instruction into just 3 weeks of relentless pressure. Each day began before dawn, with runs that grew progressively longer. 5 miles became 10, 10 became 20. The famous towers at Fort Benning, standing 250 feet tall, simulated parachute descents. Men were lifted to the top in harnesses and dropped, learning to manage the opening shock and land safely. Many candidates washed out. The physical requirements weeded out those who could not keep up. The psychological demands eliminated those who could not overcome fear of heights, of jumping, of the unknown. Those who remained emerged as a new breed of soldier. They wore special boots, received extra pay, and earned the silver wings of a qualified paratrooper only after completing 5 successful jumps. The men who survived this training developed a sense of superiority that bordered on arrogance. They believed themselves the best soldiers in the American Army and, in many ways, they were. It was this combination of skill, courage, and relentless determination that would define American airborne forces in Normandy, Bastogne, and beyond. American paratroopers looked down on regular infantry as legs, lesser soldiers who could not meet paratrooper standards. This pride served a purpose. Men who believed themselves elite fought like elite soldiers. Their training instilled not only physical capability, but psychological competence and inner assurance that would prove essential in combat. By June 1944, the American Airborne Force had grown from a 50-man test platoon into 5 full divisions. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had already seen combat in Sicily and Italy. They knew what awaited them in France. Many would not survive. They jumped anyway. The German military analyzed American paratrooper tactics, ostensibly after Normandy. Intelligence officers compiled reports and commanders discussed lessons learned. The Wehrmacht adapted its defenses to counter future airborne operations. Yet there was one element of American effectiveness that the Germans could not replicate or counter. It was not a weapon or a tactic, it was a mindset. American military culture in World War II emphasized individual initiative in ways that German culture did not. Soldiers were expected to think for themselves when circumstances required it. They were trained to accomplish objectives, not merely follow orders. This difference proved decisive in airborne operations, where the chaos of combat jumps routinely separated men from their leaders and scattered units from their plans. German soldiers, in similar circumstances, often waited for orders that never came. American soldiers improvised. German officers described this quality as elastic, mission-oriented tactics. Ironically, German military theorists had pioneered the concept in the 19th century, but by World War II, the Wehrmacht had become increasingly rigid and centralized under Hitler's control. The Americans, without knowing the German terminology, had adopted the theory and executed it more effectively than the Germans themselves. Friedrich von Dera survived the war, captured during the Battle of the Bulge, after leading a failed German paratrooper operation behind American lines. He later served in the West German Army during the Cold War and became a professor of political science. In 1948, while held at Allendorf prisoner of war camp, von Dera wrote a detailed account of his regiment's operations for the United States Army Historical Division An Extraordinary Post-War Record that highlighted the unprecedented challenges posed by American airborne forces and the mindset that made them so effective. The document, known as Foreign Military Studies Manuscript B839, remains one of the most important German primary sources on the Normandy campaign. In this account, Friedrich von Dera reflected on his experiences fighting American paratroopers, giving them full credit for their courage and tactical flexibility. He acknowledged that they had surprised him repeatedly. Time and again, von Dera had expected the Americans to fight like Europeans. He anticipated that they would follow the same military logic. He had been trained to apply the same calculations of risk and reward, the same rational assessments of what was possible and what was foolish. The Americans refused to conform to these expectations. They attacked when conventional wisdom dictated defense. They advanced when they should have retreated. They fought as individuals when units fell apart, and they fought as organized units even when their leaders were lost. They would not quit. Von Dera was a thoughtful man. After the war, he spent considerable time analyzing what he had witnessed. He concluded that the American approach to warfare was fundamentally different from the European tradition. European armies, including his own, treated war as a science. There were principles to follow, calculations to make, and rules to observe. Victory belonged to the force that applied these principles most effectively. The Americans, by contrast, treated war as a problem to be solved. When one approach failed, they tried another. When their leaders were killed, new leaders emerged. When plans fell apart, they improvised new ones. Their practicality often appeared almost careless to professionally trained officers, but it gave them an advantage no amount of doctrine or discipline could replicate. In short, the Americans were unpredictable, and unpredictability is a weapon in itself. Von Dera's post-war writings went on to influence a generation of German military thinkers, providing a rare acknowledgement of the unique combination of initiative, flexibility, and audacity that made American airborne forces so formidable in Normandy. Von Dera's analysis of American tactics was studied in militaries around the world. His conclusion that the Americans had won not merely through superior resources, but through a superior mindset challenged assumptions that had guided European military thinking for centuries. This stubborn refusal to accept defeat, this aggressive spirit that seemed almost irrational to German observers, was not something that could be taught in military schools. It came from somewhere deeper. Perhaps it came from the volunteer nature of the airborne forces. Every American paratrooper had chosen to be there. They had volunteered for the army, then volunteered again for the paratroopers, and again for combat. These were men who ran toward danger rather than away from it. Perhaps it came from American culture itself. The soldiers who jumped into Normandy had grown up during the Great Depression. They had learned resilience the hard way, and developed an optimistic stubbornness that refused to acknowledge limitations. Perhaps it came from the knowledge that they were fighting for something worth dying for. The men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions understood what the Nazis represented. They understood what would happen to Europe if Hitler prevailed. And still, they jumped into the darkness. The German officers who wrote about American paratroopers after the war were struggling to categorize something entirely new. These were not the best equipped soldiers in the world. They were not always the best trained. They were not the most numerous. But they were something the German military had never faced before. They were Americans. They came from farms in Iowa and factories in Detroit. They came from the hills of Appalachia and the streets of Brooklyn. They came from every background and circumstance that a vast and diverse nation could produce. And when they jumped from the C-47 aircraft into the darkness over Normandy, they carried with them something no German bullet could destroy: courage, initiative, and an unshakable belief that they could shape the battle. No matter the odds, they carried with them the belief that they would win. That belief, ferocious optimism in the face of impossible odds, was what the German officers sensed when they wrote their reports. It was what Schema felt, trembling in his foxhole, waiting for the Americans in the darkness. It was what von der Heydte confronted at Carentan, when his elite paratroopers were pushed back by men who had never seen combat before D-Day. The Germans might have called it Kampfgeist, fighting spirit. The Americans had a simpler word: guts, the legacy of the World War II American paratroopers extends far beyond their tactical achievements. The 82nd Airborne Division has remained on active duty from 1942 to the present day, deploying to every major American military engagement since Normandy, Korea, Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The 101st Airborne Division, which transitioned to an air assault role in the 1970s, remains one of the most deployed divisions in the U.S. Army. The Screaming Eagle patch, worn by soldiers at Utah Beach in 1944, is still worn by troops serving around the world today. More importantly, the paratroopers of World War II established a tradition of aggressive, flexible, mission-oriented warfare that continues to influence American military doctrine. The lessons learned at Brecourt Manor are still taught at West Point. The spirit that held Bastogne is still instilled in every soldier who earns the parachutist badge. The German officers, who feared American paratroopers, were right to do so. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were volunteers who had endured brutal training to earn the right to jump from aircraft into combat. They were men who accepted that their missions would often require them to fight while outnumbered, surrounded, and cut off from support. They were men who believed in themselves and in each other, and that belief made them dangerous in ways the German military machine could not predict or counter. When historians look back on the Normandy invasion, they often focus on the massive scale of the operation: the thousands of ships, the hundreds of thousands of soldiers, the elaborate deception plans, and the logistical preparations. These elements were crucial. Without them, the invasion could not have succeeded. But the men who leaped into the darkness over Normandy, the paratroopers, remind us that courage, initiative, and belief in one's mission can be just as decisive as any ship, plane, or plan. But the invasion also succeeded because 13,000 young Americans jumped from aircraft in the middle of the night into a country they had never seen, to face an enemy they had never met, with no guarantee of surviving until sunrise. The numbers were exact. The 101st Airborne Division put 6,928 paratroopers into the air aboard 432 C-47 transport aircraft, while the 82nd Airborne Division sent 6,420 men aboard 369 aircraft. Together, they conducted the largest airborne assault in history up to that point. By the end of June 6th, they had suffered approximately 2,499 casualties, 182 men of the 101st confirmed killed, 156 of the 82nd dead, hundreds more wounded, and hundreds missing, fates unknown. They jumped because they believed it was necessary. They fought because they refused to accept defeat. They won because they were exactly what the German officers feared most. They were American paratroopers. And on June 6, 1944, they changed the world. Decades later, veterans of the 82nd and 101st returned to Normandy. They came to visit the graves of fallen comrades, to walk the fields and towns where they had fought, to remember. The people of Normandy had not forgotten. In towns like Sainte-Mère-Église, streets were named after American soldiers. Monuments were erected, and every June, the American flag flew alongside the French tricolor. Children brought flowers. Adults shook hands. Yet the veterans themselves often shied away from the word hero. When asked about their actions, they deflected credit to the men they had served with, to those who never came home. They rarely spoke of their own courage. Dick Winters, who led the assault at Brecourt Manor, became perhaps the most famous paratrooper of the war, after Stephen Ambrose's Band of Brothers and the subsequent HBO series. People wrote to him, asked for autographs, called him a hero. Winters died in January 2011, at age 92. In one of his final interviews, he reflected on the title. "I was not a hero," he said. "The real heroes were the men who did not come back." This modesty was characteristic of the generation that fought World War II. They did not see themselves as exceptional. They saw themselves as ordinary people called to do an extraordinary job. Perhaps that was the source of their strength. They did not believe they were special, and that belief made them extraordinary. They simply believed they had to do what needed to be done. The German officers who faced them in Normandy might have been surprised to learn how the Americans viewed themselves. The paratroopers, who seemed so fearsome, so aggressive, so unstoppable, were often scared young men who kept moving forward, simply because they did not know what else to do. The courage was real, but it was not the courage of men who felt no fear. It was the courage of men who felt fear and acted anyway. It was the courage of men who looked at impossible odds and decided to try. That kind of courage cannot be manufactured in training camps. It cannot be ordered by generals. It can only come from somewhere inside the men themselves. The Germans recognized it. They feared Heydte ultimately. They were defeated by it. The last surviving American paratroopers who jumped on D-Day are now nearly all gone. The youngest of them would be approaching 100 years old today. Each year, fewer remain to tell their stories firsthand. This makes the historical record more important than ever. The diaries and letters, the after-action reports and intelligence summaries, the photographs and films that survived the war, these are now our primary connection to what happened in those Norman fields in June 1944. German sources are particularly valuable because they offer a perspective that American accounts cannot provide. We know what the paratroopers thought they were doing. The German documents reveal what effect they actually had. Those documents are consistent. The American paratroopers terrified their opponents, not because they were perfect soldiers, but because they were relentless. Not because they executed flawless operations, but because they kept fighting when flawless operations fell apart. The chaos of Normandy should have been a German victory. The scattered drops, the lost equipment, the broken communications, the dead officers. All of these factors should have allowed the Wehrmacht to defeat the airborne assault in detail before the beach landings could consolidate. Instead, the chaos became an American advantage. The very factors that should have destroyed the paratroopers became the factors that paralyzed the German response. This transformation of weakness into strength is the central story of the American airborne experience in World War II. It happened not because of superior planning or equipment, but because of the men who jumped. They were farmers and factory workers, students and salesmen. They were Americans who refused to quit, who improvised, who attacked when others might have waited. And in doing so, they changed the course of history. They came from every state and every background. They shared nothing except a willingness to volunteer for the most dangerous mission in the American military. And when they landed in Normandy, when everything went wrong, when the plans fell apart, when the darkness swallowed them, they discovered within themselves a capacity for improvisation and aggression that no training program could have predicted. The German officers who wrote about them after the war struggled to explain something that defied easy explanation. How did ordinary men become extraordinary soldiers? How did scattered groups become an effective fighting force? How did chaos become victory? The answers are not found in military manuals. They are found in the human spirit, in the determination that refuses to accept defeat, in the adaptability that finds solutions when problems seem insurmountable, in the courage that acts when acting seems impossible. These qualities are not uniquely American. They appear in soldiers of every nation, in moments of crisis. But in June 1944, in the fields and hedgerows of Normandy, American paratroopers demonstrated them, with a consistency that their German opponents had never encountered. The result was a victory that changed the course of the war and the course of history. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more stories from the Second World War that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to stay connected with these histories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. And leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from Texas to Tasmania, from London to Lagos. Whether you are a veteran, a history student, or someone who believes these stories matter, you are part of something meaningful here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping the memory of these men alive.